Why did Matt Russell need to meet John Candeto? Let me tell you, people, this is an amazing conversation. You're not going to want to miss this. The CEO of Colossus, the giant media empire that he's been building with the O'Shaughnessy's and everything else on his programs, meeting up with Mr. Phronesis Fund founder, the one who's investing in power laws and defining companies and how they grow and change and shape humanity. I got the two of them together. You know you want to see this. See if you can guess what's on the other side of this card. We'll see if they can guess too. Go ahead, roll the clips, Jack.
Truth is how the world really works. That's as opposed to how we think it works or how we want it to work. Truth is how the world really works, and wisdom is aligning your actions to truth.
My Twitter banner is basically a gravestone in memory of Nuance, because we live in this world of polarization. But the reality is the world is a complex system, and it evolves in ways that we have no idea, and such a lack of understanding.
I think time is one of the best filters we have. I think we're at maybe the very beginning of what this looks like in 1,000 years or something. And that's exciting to me.
When I tell you it felt like we were on a different planet, it was like, how is this a part of planet Earth and the same place in the same time zone, really, than what I came from? Something about audio, what's referenced oftentimes is what the things that are not there allow your brain to fill in the most desired state.
The classics are a classic for a reason. And so I, look no further.
You're watching Just Press Record right here on Cultish Creative YouTube. I got guests for you, people. I got guests. Now, this first one, he's Mr. Colossus. Not to be confused with the X-Men character, possibly born of the Chernobyl disaster too. I can't confirm that, but especially judging by that shed. But this guy and that Colossus have a lot in common. The ability to steel man an argument in and or around a career, across continents, across borders, and which for him it means writing institutional research reports at places like Goldman Sachs and Raven Capital, but all the while respecting the art forms beneath the businesses themselves. This guest appreciates media like few people I know. The way ideas can peacefully be distributed, yes, believe it or not, across time and space, it can mean one thing: the breaker down of businesses, the most executive officer of Colossus, Mr. Matt Reustle. Welcome to the show.
The hype hero delivers yet again. I am happy to hear my version.
Honored to do it, which is the perfect segue into this next guest. We're going to have to follow this. He's a really interesting phony. Wait, a phronesis? What's the word for this? I can imagine kind of like a brony, the All Dude My Little Pony fan collective. But instead of magical half horses, his frenetic fairy tales, they're all about practical wisdom. They're all about prudence. They're all about intellectual explorations of ways to find real world, real power, and how it underlines everything, which can only mean one thing. We phoned up Mr. Probably Not a Brony, but we'll have to ask him himself. Mr. Phronesis, the layer down of laws of power about power laws man, the only human who might do a better job than John Candy for explaining the network effects of planes, trains, and automobiles. It's John Candeto. Welcome to the show, John.
I'm going to borrow that intro for all sorts of things. That was fantastic. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Might I suggest vintage answering machines? Which,
there you go.
Either that or Cameo is the only
or
place.
Or a dying art
answer.
form, yeah.
They're a dying art form. They really are. Before the end of this episode, you're going to guess why I had to put the two of you together on this. I have it written down on the back of this card, but I've been so looking forward to this one. I want to dive right in with, you're both men with families and safe spaces removed from families to make this recording. Let's talk about bedtime stories. I'm just curious. John, let's start with you. What makes a great bedtime story?
Oh, man. Well, I'll tell you what we've been doing. So I think for a certain group of folks of our generation, there were this book series called The Great Illustrated Classics, which were effectively abridged versions of the classics. And so last night to my two little kids, we were reading Around the World in 80 Days. Before that, it was Journey to the Center of the Earth. And I don't know, so somebody expressed the notion to me a while ago, I wish I could remember who it was, that sort of the first person or people to get to a discovery kind of take it to its logical conclusion. So for example, you've probably heard the notion that all of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And I think that's true of the classics too. So, what makes a great story, we could probably do a whole pod on that. But, I think the classics are a classic for a reason. And so I, look no further.
Matt, are you doing classics for kids? What do you think makes a great bedtime story?
So we do mix in some of the classics. I have been enjoying Make Way for McCloskey and some of Robert McCloskey's excellent stories and illustrations that he has in his books. Not sure my son, who is on the verge of 4, fully appreciates the storyline. If we're just using our imaginations, oftentimes I'll just tap in and tell the story that's basically a version of him in environments that he can remember. And it might be trips to the beach that we did when we were younger, where the night went on and we stayed a little bit later and we got a certain set of food. And I can see him kind of tapping into this memory that he had. And he often wants to hear more of those stories, which, there might be some type of psychological thing that we can tap into there in terms of interest in yourself. But I find mixing these two things great and pulling out the creative stories where I have to use my own imagination and oftentimes keep them going to keep his attention focused on me and not, to get lost and escape from the room is a mechanism that has been working well recently in the Reustle household.
All right, John, first off, are you doing just the abridged classics, or are you doing like the comic book style abridged classics of these books?
They are, so the format of this series is a page of text and a page of illustrations. And so it's not quite comic book style. It's, black and white pen art, but you get an image with every page, and the audience are 4 and 7 years old. And so, sometimes they need the image to pique the interest. Sometimes it's the words. I think, Matt, to your point, I think the notion, whenever they're saying like, and what happens next, I think that's the clue that you're doing a good job.
That's the social media hook. That's the, the good thumbnail or headline in terms of watching till the end. Just a little more analog form, which I can appreciate.
John, are you ever improvising on top? Do you add the improv layer of what if you were in the story to your kids?
Sometimes I've experimented with a version of, so Matt R, what you do is kind of put some of that into ChatGPT and say, kind of spit out a story in this style with these characters. And so that's kind of fun. I find myself often reading ahead and either kind of abridging for example, the book we were reading last night, there was a whole thing about, a bet over a card game of whist, and the kids have no idea what whist is. I barely know what it is, and so, you read ahead a bit, abridge a bit, and then get on to the stuff that's easier to connect with. Yeah.
There's an art form in the read ahead too, right? Like are you dialing in your awareness of how they're responding to the story as it goes, as you read ahead? Are you literally trying to hook them further?
A bit. I'd say I try to do that at a broader level, just with life in general. So for example, something I say to my kids often is they will go to space. And I hope I'll get there too, but I think it's not hard to connect the dots on rate of progress and price and so on with space travel, and say that their generation is very, very likely to be, very common that their generation goes to space. And so, that's not always in a story, but that is kind of trying to, plant seeds that grow for a few decades. And, when they have an opportunity to go to space, and I believe they will, that won't seem like a crazy idea. They may want to, they may not, and that's fine. But I don't want it to be mom and dad didn't go to space and that's not something we do. I want it to be all possibilities are open.
My mom used to regularly threaten to kick our butts all the way to Poughkeepsie. Which most of growing up, I thought was a make-believe land. And then we went on a vacation once and I saw this funny looking town. Real. I was like, does that sign say Poughkeepsie? Is this really?
It's not as bad as it sounded like it would be. Yeah.
That's a lot closer. These are idle threats.
Yeah. My read aheads with McCloskey are required because his text is like the scene in Anchorman where, he's prepping with Unique New York. And particularly the story of Bert Dow the deep water man. I mean, it's all of these phrases that are incredibly difficult to read. And I could probably use them as prep, prior to jumping on podcasts or whatever it might be where I need to speak. It's they're tongue twisters to say the least. So yeah. Different versions of the same thing, with John's being much more world expanding.
Okay, in both of these cases, Matt, hang out on this one for a second with me. In both of these cases, you guys are respecting the stress and product testing of the classics in some way, shape, or form. Why is that so important to go back to like those stories for bedtime stories with the kids, Matt?
To me, I think classics, to John's point, like oftentimes they're classics for a reason. Not every classic necessarily holds up, but there are certain things that are tied in there with wisdom or understandings that I think you can appreciate at an early age. And I like what John said about kind of sowing the seeds that can hatch and grow over time. And I think there's a real value in terms of going back in time, and whether it was a more analog world or just offering the perspective from, different parts of the world, giving you different settings. It opens up your eyes, whether you've experienced it before and it can tap into a memory, or whether you're going to experience it in the future and you can have some more appreciation as you go into it. Could you get that from some of the more modern day texts? Probably. But I can certainly save myself some time and know that what they're getting is something that many other people have valued over the years. And it's enjoyable to me as well because it brings me back in time. So not to make it selfish, but it's fun getting to get into some of this stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of questionable things on television that you'll probably have subjected yourself to in your kid's honor, where at least if you're going to be reading, yeah.
Yeah, we'll and exactly. And then we'll get into, some of the more advanced television over the years, and I'll make sure that they're watching some of the things that I found to be classics back in my day, and we'll see if it holds up.
Yeah, I'm sure, John, you've showed your kids all the John Candy oeuvre so far to really get that education. Gus Polinski, Polka King.
There's a deep well there, yeah.
There is a deep well there of your near namesake that you need to explore. Yeah. What about you, John? What's it mean? And actually this bridge between the classics and then telling them stuff like you're going to go to space. How do you connect those two things?
Well, I think time is one of the best filters we have. One very simple sort of numeric way to look at it is, our species has authored, probably billions of books by now. And a relative minority of those has survived, day one book launch. And then, a subset of that kind of gets through the first year still on the shelf. A subset of that gets into libraries. A subset of that becomes genuine classics. And so, if you believe in certain forms of the wisdom of crowds or the wisdom of time and so on, then, just the books that are sort of, were written 200 years ago and can still be purchased easily. There's a lot of, that's a far more powerful filter than asking your buddy, what's your favorite new book? And both have their place, but, if we, somebody suggested, I would rather read the 100 best books ever written over and over and over than thousands of books. And I sort of read thousands of books, but I think there's a lot to that. I do try to read the real classics over and over and over in any genre. And some of that connects back to that notion of, sometimes the people who got there intellectually first mined most of the gold. And, I don't think we need to, figure out how to do it again. I think we appreciate what it was. And then to your point on space, so then we find the next one, right? So my stories as a, kid or an adult or, whatever, I'm a product of my time and of those that came before me and of those that invested in me. And we want the same for our kids. And so for them, their dream, my mother said to me when I was very young, and it stuck with me, each generation of a family ought to be a little better than the one that came before it. I think if we're doing our jobs as parents and our jobs as grandparents, and, if we figure out how to answer a question like, what does it take to be a really good ancestor? If we do that well, then logically, if my parents went all over the US. I've been able to work and live and travel all over the world. I want my kids to work and live and travel all over the universe.
Matt, you hitting the 4-year-old maybe yet with universal travel ambitions? Or are you trying to hold that off
No,
development?
absolutely. I mean, both my 4-year-old and my daughter, who are 2, simple things like I think what John captured earlier on the space thing. I mean, I can remember being in the early 90s. You look at some of the things that I wrote up as a 4, 5, 6-year-old in terms of what I wanted to be, and astronaut was one of those things. And I don't know what happened, in the mid 90s, late 90s, and 2000s, but that profession just kind of seemed to slip away in terms of it being a reality. And now we live in this awesome world where it is a reality. It's something that's become increasingly very possible that people will grow up and become, astronauts or go into space for some, reason, way, shape, or form, whether it be leisure or for some professional activity, which is pretty damn cool when you think about, expanding your horizons, literally. And, on a more, earth level, bringing it down a notch, we love to travel with the kids. We loved as a couple to travel the world. And I, oftentimes measure my life or do a lot of reflection anytime I get a new passport. So I just got a new passport at 10 years. And I remember, in 2015 getting the new passport, and I was thinking to myself, man, it would captured my study abroad period, some of those early travels after college, some of the work travels. And I thought to myself, I am never going to be able to fill up a passport the way I did. And then I was reflecting on this past passport where I needed to get additional pages, which is always a signal that you're doing a lot. And a lot of that came from the professional work, but it was just another good indication of how much you can learn from different cultures, different things. So that is a huge thing for us. And it's something that we tap into. I will say a lot of it has been domestic, but I think there's, it's things that we put off as a couple, exploring some of the great domestic marvels. And it's a great time to do it with kids now at this age. And then hopefully we can do it internationally in the future. And that's something that I think there's so much value to it beyond the enjoyment that you get from, exploring other places. It's just seeing different cultures and how much that means. I can remember the first time stepping down in Europe, and I definitely didn't appreciate it at the time. I was a sophomore in high school, going to Paris, staying in this tiny little room. But I look back on that with such a fond nostalgia in terms of how much that shaped me and changed my perspective. And it's become one of those places that I've really loved more and more over the years.
What
And
was
since
the
I've returned, I always think back on that. So,
what was
yes,
the trip in high school? Was that the first time you went overseas?
that was the first time I went to Europe. It may have been, if I had been abroad, it was like a Caribbean, island type
Okay.
vacation. But it was also my mom's first time going to Europe, which was pretty neat. And we were celebrating, should get these numbers right. I believe it was her 50th birthday, but I should have that exactly right. So it was a family trip. My sister, who was a little bit older than me, and then my parents and Paris. My father and I went to Normandy. It was while the Euro was going on. A lot of activity in France with the teams with Zidane and Henri at that time. So yeah, just an incredible environment to be in. Even if as a sophomore in high school, I didn't maybe appreciate some of the niceties that Paris has to offer.
Come on, everybody loves a good Parisian shower in high school when you find
Tight
that out the first
spaces,
time.
frogs' legs. Yeah, they've grown on me over time.
I'm glad to hear that. John, what about you? What was the first real like big travel memory, not just a local travel memory? How young did they start you in your house?
We did the sort of, USA road trip when I was young, rented an RV and drove everywhere. And I was too young to remember a lot of it, but I just sort of remember driving and driving and driving and driving. It's like, wow, this place is big. You know, and, so that was interesting. When I was in college, I don't know if this was my first time abroad, but it was the first time where I believe I'd probably been to Canada before that. But it was the first time when I had a Matt R type, like, this is really different. I was just hell bent on, seeing another continent. And so I bought a ticket, I flew into Frankfurt, Germany. And I mean, when I say I had no idea what I was doing, I mean, I had no idea. Like, I had the ticket and that was that. And I just thought, I packed a backpack and I was like, I'll figure it out when I'm there. And so got a Eurail pass and, made it over to France and up to England and down to Spain and just wandered. And, there's this expression that's common in my household, probably a lot of households, that the world's a book and those who don't travel only read one page. And that was when I started to understand what that meant. I remember I had I think it was just like a short stopover while switching trains in Cologne. And it just so happened the train station was by the Cologne Cathedral, which, I mean, this thing was built, talk about multi-generational thinking. It took like 600 years to build. And the folks who started building it knew it would take way past their lifetimes. And I mean, I would just love to interview folks like that and be like, what were you thinking? Right? Like, what motivated you? Like, you probably knew your children's children's children would not see the completion of this thing. And yet you worked on it for decades. But I wandered into the cathedral and there was an organ concert going on. And I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I mean, just a giant Gothic masterpiece. And, the ceilings are infinite feet tall and the sound is echoing and the whole, I mean, I still sort of get goosebumps thinking about it. It was one of those experiences where just, wow, like this stuff is in the world and we can go see it. And so, I mean, between that and eating some phenomenal food and, one adventure spurs the next one. Matt R, to your point, I think when we met, I was in the middle of moving from Philadelphia to Orlando, Florida. And so we did that by way of California. So we got a car and just drove all the way over to California, down the coast and all the way back east. And we hit a lot of the national parks, the U.S. national parks on the way, which I had never been to most of them. And to your point on there being great stuff here, I mean, going to the Grand Canyon, I saw it for the first time as an adult on that trip. And I was like, I get why you would travel from anywhere on this planet to go see that. And it was sort of this like kind of patriotic moment of, America's phenomenal too, because I've spent a lot of my time abroad, even though I was born and raised in the States and live here now. And also one of the things that stuck with me and kind of on this multi-generational point, let's say we went to, I don't know, maybe 10, national parks. In almost every park, some folks who were, closer to the end of their life than the beginning, we were with our little kids who were probably 4 and 1 at the time. And some, elderly folks came up to us, sometimes multiple times, and said, I'm so glad that you're doing this with your kids. We waited till the end of our lives to come see these things, and we wish we'd seen them much, much, much earlier. And I'm a big fan of the wisdom of elders and the wisdom of ancients. And so that's one of those where, when you hear a consistent message from folks with a lot of gray hair, I think you're wise to pay attention. And that really stuck with me that, I got to start traveling the world when I was in college. My kids have gotten to start traveling the world. They're not going to remember a time when they didn't. And to the extent that that's possible for people to do, I mean, I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing.
Matt, we might need to cut that last 2 minutes of the answer because if my wife hears that, she will use that as fuel. If it were up to her, I think we would be traveling at all moments, despite her schedule being probably the busiest of anyone in the family. Trip planning is the number one activity on her agenda.
Matt, you and I are both in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
We'll try to hide this one from our spouses because, I already was feeling the same thing. I was like, oh boy, had to dust off the passport.
Yep.
A trip is in the future. What about, Matt, I want you to build on what John just said. There's something about when you're in front of something like a national park or you go somewhere like somewhere special like this. And I'm even thinking of a trip my wife and I took within the last just over a year ago. Like we went out to Joshua Tree. And there's certain things that there's a different experience when you're taking it in front of you. Like your relation to this object or this place or this piece of art or whatever you've traveled to experience. like the Grand Canyon story is a perfect example of this, where sharing that experience when it's in front of your eyes, it's a whole variation on like, reading the storybook together. You got any
Yes.
good ones that come to mind?
Well, I think it's interesting for a couple of ways. Your story about the Grand Canyon was funny because it's often a story that I laugh about with my parents, and my sister laughs as well. When I was maybe in 4th or 5th grade, we drove from Las Vegas to the Grand Canyon, but my mom was terrified and would not let me within 30 yards of any of the Grand Canyon. So I often say, I traveled there for whatever it was, 5 hours through Death Valley, but never actually got to see the Grand Canyon itself. And I love to peg my mother with that story. But it's one that I distinctly remember, and I did get to actually see quite a bit of it. To your point, I think there's often this saying, oh, the pictures can't even capture it. One of my favorite things is to watch people try to take pictures of the moon, where you see people lined up, and it's like, this is just one of those things I think we can all accept. Unless you have the most amazing tripod advanced camera, like your iPhone is not going to capture the moon. Let's just take it all in together and acknowledge its amazingness. But it goes beyond that. I think traveling, the one that stands out to me the most, to Patagonia. This was just my wife and I. It was when I was on garden leave from one of my first jobs. We planned it at the last minute. And when I tell you it felt like we were on a different planet, it was like, how is this a part of planet Earth and the same place in the same, time zone, really, than what I came from? So that to me was like one of the most amazing things. We got out once we got to our location. We walked in this insane wind. We see flamingos. It's cold. I didn't know, flamingos lived in these cold areas. There's bones from the, animals that died that you're not supposed to touch. And then you get to this water and it feels like you're in Interstellar. And I'm thinking to myself, like, how is this possible? Like possibly our planet. So that was one where, I think that it could be cultural, where you interact with the people and you just see a certain way of life that feels different. And then it can be environmental, whether it's something like the Grand Canyon and the scale and the size and the uniqueness of it, or something like Patagonia, where you're just like, this is just wild.
John, what's your most out of world experience? Like when you get there and you're like, this is Joshua Tree for me, where I'm like, I now understand every Dr. Seuss illustration.
Yeah, that's a good one. And Matt R., that was a beautiful meditation on Patagonia's been on my list for a while. I've never been there, but
we're all sold.
Yeah, I'll redouble my efforts to.
Interestingly, my wife is very into, Italy, France, kind of or islandish type things. This was something that we thought was kind of a Matt trip. It was her favorite trip, despite that. So, whether that helps in terms of the sales effort.
Yeah. So Matt Z, you said where the most out of world place?
Yeah, you're talking about space. You can't do that one exactly, but you can go to a place that feels environmentally just like all your senses go, where am I?
Yes.
Where's a place like that you've experienced, with or without the kids?
Sometimes I love driving. And so sometimes I think about just what are the best drives we've been on. And I'll give you two.
Okay.
One, we were, just before we had our first kid, our son, we basically decided let's do all of Ireland because we never really spent time there. And so we, flew into Dublin and rented this little 6-speed stick shift VW something, which is heaven for me, and then just off we went and we drove all the way around everywhere. And we were in Northern Ireland, and I later learned this is a somewhat famous road. I had no idea. We sort of zipped past a road, and there was this, sometimes you pass somewhere and you kind of look back and you're like, we need to explore that. And so, reverse, back up, go down the road. And there was a road that oscillated between literally just blasted into the side of a cliff with more cliff below you and ocean, to across farmland, to, through a field, back to a cliff, back, just phenomenal. I mean, if there's heaven in the World Rally Championship sort of stage setting, like this would be it. It's called Tor Head Road, TORR. And just, part of the beauty of that was it was so unexpected. Part of the beauty of that was it was just beautiful. And part of the beauty of that was you had 4 or 5 different distinct, it was like flipping through the pages of a Dr. Seuss book, you just hit these wild landscapes, every 5 minutes. And in the same vein, we drove in between Zion, Capitol Reef, and Moab, which I think that part of the country, just looks like another planet every 30 minutes. You're on the moon for 30 minutes, and then suddenly you're back in the desert, and then suddenly, oddly enough, there's stuff growing again. And so, but to the point on needing to see the stuff, I mean, I remember some of what that part of the world smelled like. I think Matt you and I talked to Josh Wolf about, like we are learning to recreate smells, which is phenomenal. I think everybody's had the experience of like you walk in your grandparents' house and like the smell of the carpet or something is just like, that's part of the place. And you don't get that stuff through a screen. You don't get it through a book. You don't get it through a story. You get it by, the feel of the wind in Ireland. I remember, the stillness of the air in the desert. I remember, there are things like that where you just, our bodies are these phenomenal sensing engines. And I think we probably understand less of how they work than what we do understand. Right? And so you kind of just have to go,
Yeah.
You just have to let all the senses be engaged and then the stories come.
I love the sense focus, and it's something where I'm obviously very into audio and podcasts. And I can tell you with certain episodes, many of my favorite episodes, exactly where I was. I was on the West Side Highway in New York, walking back from work, or I was in LAX on a converting flight, or I was walking on a beach on a vacation. And there's this distinct connection with place, with audio, but from smell, to your point, I'll wake up some mornings and I'll go outside and there's fresh cut grass and it will bring me back to soccer practices in high school. Or I'll smell like this certain rubber scent that's associated with tracks where it will bring me back to track meets, or even like stodgy gyms and things like that. I'm just like, these, senses are so powerful. And to your point, in ways that I don't think we fully appreciate. Mm-hmm. And I think when it's one of those things where vision, I think, can be associated with so much, to your point, but experiencing something is where those other senses come into play. And they can't, at least up until this point, be recreated in any way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes these things stand out so much. It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So as a sense is like the immersion beyond, do you feel like there's a story in a sense, or is it just that the story attaches back to the sense itself? Like the story of soccer practice after you smell the grass. And if you're me, it triggers your allergies, even if you don't.
It's interesting. I think with something, I've tried to think a lot about this, particularly with audio. And I think when, audio is something where your focus is so much on the conversation that you're having, that you subdue some of the vision or taking in of the other things around you, but you kind of isolate the environment to some extent, and you have a picture of where you are, but you're listening to this conversation. And it would be no different than if we had a great conversation in a particular bar, we're going to remember where we had it. Or if we had a certain date, and we had this really engaging thing, like you can imagine the setting, but what you're focused on is the conversation in your ear. On the sense side, it had more to do with the repetition to me, I think, of that smell, of the early track workouts, with that rubber, that you can associate with the track, or the cut grass, associated with those tournaments on the weekends, and that certain blend of, probably like a mildewy, scent, and probably some geese shit mixed in there. But it had a certain distinctness that stands out to something that I repeatedly did over and over again. But it's interesting when you have some like really larger in life experience than, in terms of what John was explaining. I think it could just like overpower you, and it's going to stand out forever. And it gets tucked in that certain memory bank that we can tap into, not in the memory bank of things that they're there, but we just don't, we can't remember them quite as well.
What do you think about that, John? Tie senses back to the stories we tell ourselves.
All right, bear with me on this.
I'm excited for that.
This is why you're here.
Yeah.
Exactly, getting questions like this to ask you.
So I think the zeitgeist of our Western culture is in this gigantic epistemological straitjacket. We learned about the double-blind study, I don't know, 100 years ago or something, and which is phenomenal, right? I mean, I the ability to cure cancer, which we can do at increasing rates, is phenomenal. So I'm not slighting that, but the double-blind study is a way of learning what is true. It's not the only way. And so the whole conversation we just had, one way you could characterize it is, we all know through our experience that there are things that we can't quite quantify and we're sort of struggling for words for, but that are real and that are incredible and that are part of what life is made of. And then imagine if somebody came along and said, let's do a double-blind study on the best place to travel. Like, it would just miss the whole point, right? You can't capture the feeling that, Matt, that you had in Patagonia with you can, and so somebody would try to sort of cram this into some sort of bad framework and come out with a paper and it'd get peer reviewed. And then suddenly the best place to go is like your backyard or something, which is a great place, right? But it's kind of misses the whole notion that I'd say we understand less about ourselves than we actually, of all the things we do understand about humans, there's probably a lot more that we don't understand. And so if you just are willing to be a bit humble about that, then it means your epistemology changes from, I only believe I can, know what is crammable through a double-blind study, to that is a means to understanding truth, but one of many. And so, Matt Z, to your question, Matt R, I've had the exact same experience. When I have an aha moment, I remember the texture of the fabric of the chair I'm sitting in. Or I've had the whole, I remember the long walkway that connects the terminals through Charlotte Airport. I've, had a number of good podcasts playing while I go down that long corridor. And I remember the first time I stumbled across the genre of wisdom literature in my room, when I was in 7th grade, and what the book, the cheap laminate bookshelf that the book was, and there's all that stuff where, is it the story or is it part of the story? I don't know. Is it part of the experience and part of how we experience life, both as we prepare to do it and then we do it and then we remember it? Absolutely. I imagine that Johnson & Johnson baby powder is probably one of the most powerful, olfactory triggers on the planet because of how many people associate that with childhood, both as an infant and then as a parent. And so I don't know. I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer other than I do think the right posture is we ought to have some humility as to what we do understand and kind of just really open up our epistemology to. There's a lot we don't understand here, but it's nonetheless very real and very important.
Big time. Agree with everything you mentioned there. My Twitter banner is basically a gravestone in memory of Nuance because we live in this world of polarization. And I get it. Polarization is a much simpler way to scale an idea of this is good, this is bad. This is, you're either this or you're that. You classify things into these buckets and it's much easier for the world to catch on to those stories. But the reality is the world is a complex system and it evolves in ways that we have no idea and such a lack of understanding. So there's so many things to your point where I can't explain why, but I have a very strong feeling that this is true and it plays into it. And to your point, funnel cake at a boardwalk. Do we really understand why we have this strong association and tie?
Because it's from the gods?
Yeah, exactly. It's it's hard to even put on. It oftentimes the smell to me, yes, it is amazing. But I think I get at least equivalent satisfaction just from the smell that I do from the taste of it, which is kind of this interesting dynamic. So there's so many things like that out there. And not to go into this realm, but I think what John was talking about there is why I often think a lot of the AI discussion is really humorous to me because, we're defining, whether they will ever get to this point of consciousness and all this stuff. And when Skynet gets self-aware, whatever it might be, we don't even understand our own brains to the full capacity, and we have such a lack of appreciation for how this is all evolved with us. And it's like, well, like, have we ever thought about that in reference to this and like taking those two things together? So like, not to dive too far into that topic, but it's just such an interesting thing to me. And I think, yes, it's good to be able to have direct linear connections to things, but also just have this grander appreciation of all of the nuances in the complex system that we live in.
Everything is computer, but everything's not Terminator. It's a good reminder, right? Matt, you've definitely thought more than either of the two of us, at least, and probably a whole bunch of other people on this connection, specifically with just the hearing sense, with the audio sense, because of the work you do. What are some of the ways you actually think about this? This is actually fascinating to me. How do you understand that?
Yeah, it's something where I've actually looked for a lot of the science that might be out there or existing in terms of this connection, because again, going back to strong feelings or strong beliefs I had without really strong evidence to tie into, but the parasocial relationships that can be formed in audio, there is something there that to me feels stronger than any other medium. And in a way, I can appreciate, what video allows for in terms of scaling and discoverability and all of those elements, and you can get that parasocial relationship. But I was kind of looking back because, over time, I created these, like almost I was in these communities, and I can remember distinctly during COVID walking on my street, and I was laughing at a podcast that I was listening to about an inside joke. And I'm thinking, if anybody saw me, they would think, like, who is this psychopath? Is he the next Joker out here? Just walking around, laughing to himself like a giggle fest. And I'm like, what, how is this created? And you can go back in time, the first reference to parasocial relationships, I think, was in the 50s or the 60s. And then there's really interesting report about it. And since then, there's been a lot of studies. But something about audio, what's referenced oftentimes is what the things that are not there allow your brain to fill in the most desired state. So, if you're just hearing someone, you do not appreciate the walls that might exist between you. It feels like you are truly in the room, in a way that feels a little bit different than audio. Any type of characteristics about the host or the guest, you might fill in either with a very idealistic view of what they might look like, how they might act, their posture, their gestures, whatever it might be, how they might be welcoming you into the conversation. Versus it's a little bit harder to do otherwise. And I think about this with music as well, in terms of like the impact that it has on us internally. I have this other belief that there's certain songs where, for some reason, when I try to run my fastest mile, it's like a 20-second difference, which is an insane amount of time. And would I be able to do that without that music playing? Like, yes, I should theoretically be able to do that. It's inside me, but there's something about, the pace and the impact that gets a reaction inside my body, physical reaction. And I just think there's so many things like that, which, we're on a very, surface level understanding of how it's impacting us. So I think I gave you an answer with a lot of very loose threads, but it's something that I think about a lot. And, there's some very basic surface level theories that I think can explain some of it.
Well, if anybody can undo this sweater, because I'm sure the sweater song is not what's getting you to that faster mile. But John, what do you think? What do you think about that? Maybe specific to audio. And I mean, we're all podcasters here. Anybody who's on the audio only feed, we're all Adonises too, just for the record. Like just three beautiful, beautiful men.
Yeah.
Don't click the YouTube. Let the myth stay alive.
Whatever you think the most wonderful human is, that's what we are. Right?
There's three of them here for you.
You're in the room with us right now.
Yeah,
we're all
right,
together. Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
in your ears while you're dropping your coffee pot. What do you think about that, John? Especially the parasocial relationship that either you have when you're listening to something, or when you're, so thoughtfully curating the stuff that you share in the audio format with other people.
Yeah. Well, just before we go there, Matt R., parasocial is a new word for me. So what can you define that? What does parasocial mean?
This is great.
Yeah,
exclusive. Matt Reustle. Parasocial definition.
You put me on the spot without being able to directly tie in. but it's essentially a relationship, and I think what's often viewed as it's a one-way relationship is kind of the
Mm.
original way it was desired. And the first reference is a famous radio broadcaster female that used to do these shows at nights that were targeted at males, that were coming home from work. And she was this idealistic view of the female white figure in terms of what those men deserved. Again, very dated, very misogynistic. Yeah, but it tapped into these males in terms of feeling this connection to this woman,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
very strong, like, oh, we get each other, we understand each
Mm.
other. And there's now in that first form, the parasocial relationship is very one sided and can be viewed as unhealthy because it's almost taking advantage of the listener's feelings. I think it's increasingly viewed as this, 1.5 way relationship where there's a lot of interaction with communities, and that's evolved over time. But it is this strong ability to create relationships with many people at once that feel very individualized.
Mm.
And that's done through something, audio, increasingly things like streaming, Twitch, whatever it might be, and YouTube, where the relationship is formed through these mediums.
Mm. Interesting. So
Yeah,
I've
you
got
should get the scientific definition to make sure I wasn't too far off.
no, but
Eventually,
I mean, that's the I don't know. That's the um I think a lot of the challenges we have as humans at our current moment is humanity as a species stumbling over scale. And so, our ability to create parasocial relationships, I mean, basically it it barely existed, pre-radio. I think of things like maybe a congregation's relationship to their pastor. Most people don't know the pastor, but the pastor, but that was sort of it, sort of limited to the size of regular human gatherings. And then suddenly with radio, we can go global, in under a generation. And so it's a version of stumbling over scale. I think we're probably still figuring out what to do about all this and how to do it well. But to the point on, I remember a study that was looking for predictors of divorce in couples, and the strongest predictor was whether or not you could detect resentment in either of the couple's tones. And you don't get that in written text, obviously. They can say everything and it sounds lovely written down, and then you hear it and you're like, man, there's and so, if we go to from maybe the kind of rationalist angle, there's a form of information compression, right? There's a lot of signal in the timbre of your voice, in the pacing of what you say, not just what you say, but how you say it. If we go at it from the, kind of right hemisphere, sort of more holistic view, I hesitate to say no. I think we believe, some would probably say no, that particularly nonverbal communication sort of skips the rationalist side of the brain and goes straight to the sort of more sensory side of the brain. And that's very interesting, right? So back to your point, I'm being able to run a faster mile while listening to a certain song. I believe I proved in college that my test scores were marginally better if I listened to the Rocky theme song on the way into the classroom. And that would not quite fit a double-blind study, but I got enough signal that I believe it. And then, 20 years later, our daughter was born during COVID. So we're in a hospital in Philly, and it's June of 2020. Everything's still locked down. I was lucky to be able to be in the room with my wife. And the Rocky theme song starts playing at 2 a.m. And so I find a nurse. I'm like, what's the deal? And they're like, well, every time we release a COVID patient, we play the theme song. And there's just, I mean, you think about how much, you go all the way back to Rocky 1, and then just all the layers of information that have been compressed into that clip, that dun, 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 and it's phenomenal. I mean, I don't think we understand all of what it triggers in the brain, right? But you hear 5 seconds of audio, and, the equivalent amount of information that you might only be able to get from 2 hours of motivational speeches, you now get in 10 seconds. And it's so, I mean, I don't know, my answer is yes to all of it, right? Like, it is real. It does matter. I think broadly, I sometimes try to imagine what the book of the future looks like, because if you think about writing as a medium, so you go back to, we created papyrus, now we can write stuff that can be transported with us. And I mean, even that is not that long ago relative to how long humans have been around. But, writing was kind of our original form of persisting information for future generations. And then audio, like the ability to capture and preserve audio, came, a few hundred years ago. And so we have, a few thousand years of writing, a few hundred years of audio, and then even less of video. And so I kind of think, all right, the books behind me, I mean, do the books of the future look like that? And I think those will always be around and they have a place. And, an interesting question is, what is worth subtracting from information you communicate, right? So I think audio only is important in a way that's distinct from audio and video. Sometimes audio only is actually a better format. But I think the book of the future is sort of video when video is the best form of communication, audio when audio is the best form of communication, text when text is the best form, images when images is the best. And you get at this with a picture's worth a thousand words, right? And sometimes compressing 1,000 words to a picture is what you're trying to get at. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes 1,000 words are important. And so I kind of, zooming all the way ahead, I can imagine sort of a book of the future, us getting much better as a species at saying, this is a time for audio. I think, Matt, you're pushing the boundaries of this in all sorts of ways, right? Where it's just like that. What is a time for audio? What is a time for video? What is a time for, show notes? What is a time for, and, from that perspective, I think we're at maybe the very beginning of what this looks like in 1,000 years or something. And that's exciting to me.
Yeah. My great friend and colleague, David Senra, has this saying that the podcasts are the printing press for the spoken word. And there's a lot of power to that, in terms of what you mentioned. There's a lot of things that the written word can express in terms of the voice and the emphasis, and you can read the same sentence 5 different ways. It's why Slack communication, I think, is quite disastrous sometimes for cultures. And to your point, video takes that an even step further with body language and gestures and some type of reciprocation that you can feel. So, and I'm sure there, we can barely comprehend it. So there's ways of like isolating these things, and then there's ways of building on them, because I often think about books themselves and written text, and I still think it's the best way to absorb the information. I listen to audiobooks, particular genres, quite a bit, but I will be the first to admit, do I capture as much as I do when I'm sitting there with a book, really isolated and able to take notes? It's night and day in terms of difference. The audio experience probably ingrains some things that I can't fully appreciate, and it could be more entertaining sometimes. So I think you're right, in terms of what we can fully appreciate. And just the last thing I have to mention is, when you were telling that story, I thought you were going to say that you started to play the Rocky theme song, which I was like, oh boy.
That's some straight Philly stuff right there. My kid will come into the world. That's some Philly stuff.
What you mentioned is actually really interesting, because I was listening to this episode of the Rewatchables, a podcast where they reference these movies and go back and revisit them. And they were talking about the first 30 minutes of Rocky, Rocky 1 are quite slow. There's not fighting. There's not a lot of action. And they said, if you didn't have that theme song that you knew was going to come, like the first time you were experiencing it, now we know it's a classic, but the first time you were experiencing, you might be like, oh, what's going on here? But just knowing that that's waiting for you. And to your point, I mean, I don't know what it is, but once you hear it, it's impossible not to just get this adrenaline rush.
Yeah. I had a chat with someone earlier this week who works in, and I wish I could remember the specific words, but she's in the medical system here in Orlando, and her profession is basically music as part of the healing process. And part of what she does is find, for example, someone who's had a stroke and loses the ability to use half their body, and then you're trying to, through physical therapy, regain that. Find songs and rhythms that trigger physical response. So if you're trying to learn to walk with some sort of consistent pattern, find a rhythm that you can walk to, and things like that. And it's the sort of thing where, again, I kind of think we're at the beginning of this kind of knowledge, but we've all had the experience of suddenly you find yourself tapping your foot and you didn't even realize you were doing it. Like stuff is going on there, right? And it probably doesn't fit a double blind study, at least not yet, but it is absolutely real. I remember I'd forgotten this story, but since we've been dwelling on audio, when my son was born, so our firstborn, one of my reactions to becoming a dad, I mean, this was like minute 2 of his, life. It was like, he's got to hear Led Zeppelin, I don't know why, but it just felt like the right thing. And
when the water breaks, when the levee breaks. I mean, I see the connection. You got to sell me. Did you do it? Did you pull it?
Oh,
out?
yeah.
What song?
Yeah. It was Stairway to Start, and then we just kept going. And yeah.
That's fair. That's a good choice.
Yeah.
Solid run.
Hey, the organic feeling, you gotta go with that when it feels right and the moment. Yeah, there's something to that. Yeah, I mean, our body has reflexes, right? Which we can understand on the surface level, literally, as they do the reflex studies. Would it be surprising at all if there were other reflexes that we had, associated with audio, video, sensory cues? No, again, not going to pass the blind test study, but I think like you could have these hypotheses, which at least allow you to believe and accept that there's a reality to it.
Well, it connects everywhere, right? So when, I don't know, for me, when capital markets get really wonky and confusing, I often feel like I just need to go on a walk, or I need to go play guitar, or I need to read poetry, or something that's like the other end of the torrent of mostly kind of, numbers-based information flying at, it's just, and I don't know why that is, but I suspect probably most of the people we know have a version of that. It's, I need to go see beauty. I need to go see nature. I need to move my body. I need to hear music. I need to and so in that sense, it's sort of, I mean, if that's not evidence that this stuff is real, I don't know what is. And then, that it doesn't fit into a double blind study is more, I would say, a weakness of those that believe that epistemology is only true through double blind. So I would say like that's the weakness there rather than the other way around.
What do you think about Matt? What do you do? What's your, when work or the quantitative thing or the thing most devoid of quality in your life where you're like, I have to run in the other direction? What's your equivalent retreat? How do you tip the scale?
Yeah, I think there's certain things that go back in time, which are like absolute go-tos whenever things around you, your environment is stressful. And it's like, okay, go back to the basics. Am I working out? That is just like, it is a natural drug in terms of fueling you and giving you a better mindset. The food that you're putting into your system, monitoring if you're consuming alcohol, like those types of things are very simple and basic. There's probably, I'm not a meditator, but I would imagine based on the amount of people that reference meditation that could, fit in there. But then, once it goes beyond that, I'm very similar to John in the sense that it's often a removal from that environment and getting something that is going to disconnect me. I used to love having competitive sports for this. So even, post-college playing in basketball leagues, soccer leagues, this was something that was going to consume my brain. I was going to be fully focused on this. It was going to drown out all that other noise. And it was going to allow me to, for lack of a better phrase, escape from reality in a very healthy way. And now it's been more, this is where like science fiction has come in for me as a genre. And this will be an audiobook where, I will listen, I will walk. It's very interesting. I am into the kind of like cheapy techno thriller Crichton style stories, because it's expanding my brain in terms of the science. It's not over the top and tapping into, like business dynamics or, whether these balance sheets are truly at risk, something like that. And that disconnect actually allows probably the other side of my brain to recover in a healthy way, in a non-distracted way, versus it's like a muscle, it's like, you're not supposed to lift the same muscle every day. You need to allow for that recovery. So however you can provide as much relief for it, and maybe it's by, putting the stress on another muscle, that's going to allow it to come back and get that fuel tank back to 100. And in those environments, like you're stressing those muscles a lot. So I think the recovery is even more needed.
And there's maybe if I try to build on that a little bit, we know there's something that happens, let's say whatever in your brain is trying to figure out if a balance sheet is at risk. We know there are things that keep going even when you're not dwelling on it. And so I often think of the, top level chess players will often stare at a chessboard with a chess problem before they go to sleep. And then it's not uncommon for them to wake up in the morning with the answer. And so we know that the brain keeps working on the problem, whether or not we're directly focused on it. And so I often think that not only is it, relaxing to go play guitar when I'm stressed, I also actually think it's often the wisest next action. And I'll often, I'll find, after playing guitar or something, I'll come back and realize, actually, this is okay. Let's move on, or something. And I can't explain all of what's going on in there other than it's not nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, removal from the environment, even though there's still some processing going back on. And it could be like a being stuck in the weeds thing, even if the answer that you need is maybe in the weeds, applying a bigger picture, and pairing that. Like I love thinking about like sandwich style things where you're taking something very macro and very micro, and the answer is somewhere in the middle oftentimes. But giving yourself the opportunity to do that. Yeah. It's like, you can do more damage by continuing to stare at the same thing without removing yourself and allowing like greater perspective to build.
Yeah. It's such a powerful thing to remind you, because there's a connection to that too, right? In the complete sensory change up. And John, I can relate. This is like, I'm thrilled we moved, and like the guitar is in that corner right now.
I see some guitar cases over your shoulder there. Yeah.
Cases there. There's one out and whatever right here. And it's for that exact reason. Sometimes just to turn around and for 10 minutes do something is complete sensory overwhelm.
Yep.
And that feels like that's another way to kind of like suppress all the senses again. What are you thinking, Matt? I see your mind.
It just brings up when you think about certain athletes in very high pressure moments where they will go to a very specific routine. So whether it's, at the foul line in basketball, having a specific free throw routine, maybe it's a certain breath work. But it's zeroing in and, kind of isolating yourself in this micro moment where you're going back to a repetition. It's something that your muscles are familiar with. It kind of drowns out a lot of the things around you. And that's like, it's a little bit of a different version of that, but I think it gets back into the same thing in terms of the sensory overload and playing around with these things in a way where you're just kind of like creating the optimal setting for whatever it is you need to be doing.
John, is that word play? Is that essential inside of this too?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you think about the word play?
Well, I think there's a few pieces. One is just knowing that the brain, that sometimes the best thing to do is sort of leave the brain or leave the problem in the brain somewhere, but focus on something else. And I don't think we understand all of why that works, but yesterday I stuck on a problem. I went and played tennis for an hour. And that was, I'm absolutely convinced that was the right next action, as opposed to continuing, because some of this is the epistemology point of where, when you're at a screen, you're sort of in this rationalist, numbers dominated, it's a certain means of pursuing truth. And it's neither good or bad, but it's far from the only means. And so you can sort of work that to its logical end. And then something from an investment perspective, like just go use the product again. If you're invested in something that has a great product, sometimes the best thing you can do is go use the product and remember why, you believe this was a great product to begin with. I mean, there's so much information that comes from that. And so, there's something about just passing the problem to different parts of the brain to work on it. I think there's something about, like, even at a higher level, just remembering what it is to be human, I don't know, you go like pick up a guitar and sing, I gave her my heart and she wanted my soul, right? Like that's a beautiful line. That's a piece of poetry, paired with music and with all the layers of Bob Dylan and the cultural and whatever, and again, I don't think we understand all of what's happening, but, I know my response to the rational kind of zeitgeist I'm in when I'm trying to figure out something, if I go do something beautiful, it's a little different. And I would say definitely additive. So Yeah, I mean, I wish we understood more, but I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me, and I think deeply in the realm, hopefully we all make it to have a ton of gray hair and pass some wisdom down, generations. Matt, you're doing a great job there, Matt Z.
I'm growing the hair and the gray hair.
Yeah.
Why I don't change the lighting in the room is.
But like, you think about what our grandparents' generation. I mean, I think this is probably broadly true. I don't remember ever hearing any one of our grandparents' generation saying sometimes the best thing you can do is like go outside and walk with a problem. Like, I don't think that was common, and obviously your mileage may vary, right? But like that just wasn't a common or as common as it maybe is today in certain parts of the world. And so, perhaps that's something we figured out a little bit more than or rediscovered, as it were. And whatever the case is, I hope that we're passing some of this stuff down. Like I grew up in offices that were sterile, maybe, just very functional. And my office is a combination of books over here and guitars hanging on the wall over there. And that's not right for everybody, but Matt Z, it's not surprising to me you've got a guitar there too, right? And I think, at a higher level, I hope some of what becomes, grandparents' wisdom for our generation that we pass down is some of this more integration of, different means of epistemology rather than the pure sterile rationalist toolkit.
Do you think that there's any diminishing return or potential for the curve to actually inflect lower as it relates to introspection, self-awareness, and then just like broader awareness of how people might be thinking about situations? And I can just paint this out like in an example where oftentimes I will find myself in a situation where I will feel like somebody did something shitty. And my initial instinct is, well, that was shitty. But then I will think, well, you know what? They have this circumstance where they're reporting it to this person. They need to make sure that this person is taken care of. If that comes at the expense of me, that's probably the net right decision on their part to do. And like you end up explaining all of these things away where sometimes I think, having the blinders on can be a more advantageous way to approach things because you can almost become like not numb to the external forces, but really have appreciation for all of the nuance that goes into things. And I'm curious if you have any perspective on that. Like if there's limitations to the benefits of introspection and then like broader perspective on this stuff.
John, this is all you. You're the epistemology.
You're both
expert
welcome
here.
to answer. Yeah, you think about this a lot, John. It's something that I like to bring up with people who think about this.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Unfortunately, the audio cut out for like the last 10 seconds. So you said, do I have any appreciation for
the either the limitations or the benefit curve potentially like falling off? Like if there's negatives associated with an appreciation for the nuance that we have in our brains.
Yes, I think we're seeing two really clear ones in our generation and the generations a little bit below us. Really clear ones. One is encapsulated in the return to office debate right now, where there is a real belief. I mean, it's amazing to me how you get, 5, 10, 15 years younger than us, so, like half a generation, and nobody picks up the telephone. And it's all text. And I don't mind evolving modes of communication, but there's an unspoken belief that if it can't be written down, it's not worth communicating. And that misses the timbre of your voice, right? It misses the pacing of your language. It misses, can I sense whether this is urgent or not? The mess of Slack, right? It's all, and so there's an unspoken assumption that just, if I can't do it over Zoom, we shouldn't do it. And so that one I think is a really interesting debate to watch, because ultimately I think it matters a lot that I know what it feels like to shake your hand. And I know what it feels like to give you a hug. I mean, I can think of people now that are like the best huggers I know, and they're excited to see you and they squeeze really hard and whatever. And there's so much and we know this too. Like we know this with kids, as soon as a kid's born, what do? You put them on the mom's chest. Right? Like we know this stuff is powerful. I mean, heck, that's one that got through a double-blind study. right? Like we know this is real, and then for some reason there's just this, I think, pretty strong force of, if you're a knowledge worker, Zoom is enough. And so that's one where I think the unspoken assumption is all the information from that is not sight and low quality sound. Not everybody has a great microphone, is not important. So I worry about, not worry, but I think that's one we're gonna almost, like, we lost and we're gonna have to rediscover. Um, and then the other one is, and I'm definitely susceptible to this, when you sit in a room by yourself, I think we're all in rooms by ourselves, with a hard problem. Sometimes the best thing you can do is find somebody to talk to about it. And, when you're in an office setting, that's often not that hard. When you have your room and you're by yourself, whenever, sometimes the wisest thing to do is go engage with another human, and it's not nearly as easy. And so I do think that actually results in a lot of, for lack of a better term, wasted time, angst, problems, poor decisions, lower quality decisions, lost opportunity for community, whatever you want to call it, because there's sort of this, I obviously have this unspoken assumption that I should spend a great deal of time alone. And I think some of that is true. My prior world before investing was all airplanes and hotels and humans and meetings and all. And that was too far the other way. I didn't have time to think or write. But my temptation now is actually the pendulum swings too far the other way. So I wish I had a better answer than the balance is
No,
what
it's,
matters.
yeah.
But, yeah.
I think it's pretty thoughtful. And what you mentioned there at the end, that's another thing for your earlier question, Matt, in terms of things you can do. When I have a bad day, it is amazing how often that can be reversed by having one great conversation with someone. And I do agree. My tendency is way more, my father was an engineer, so I think it comes somewhere from him, where there's a comfort in being alone, but it's the power of the conversation, the interaction, the tribal nature that we are a tribal species. There's something to that. That's another thing. Put it in there with going for a great run or something along those lines.
To bring this maybe back to the kid point too, I've lived with kids in high density apartment buildings. I've lived with kids. Now I live in a suburb where there's, space between houses and all that. And I wish I had more suggestions on this, but I really wonder if go back to why was any of this possible? It was really 1970, we get the jumbo jet, the cost of air travel starts to plummet. And so here again, in like a generation, this is stumbling over scale. Suddenly we went from, travel across large distances is sort of not possible. And that even the Eisenhower interstate system in the 50s and so, right? So like in the last 100 years, we went from, you basically can't have a relationship with your family unless you live close to them, to they can live dozens or hundreds of miles away, to they can live thousands of miles away and you can still see them for Christmas, and many people can afford that. And that's structured where we live, how we live. Broadly, I think there's this unspoken, you kind of go where the job is, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying everyone lives this way, but if we then go back to, what does that mean for our little kids? Well, my kids know our neighbors, but their range of their ability to travel and see other neighbors is very limited. For the most part, when we were in apartment buildings, it seemed like the closer physically we lived to people, the less well we knew them. I don't know why that is, but and so I look at my little kids and I want them to have the neighborhood experience I did growing up. And there's, for me that was the 80s, like that, and that's harder even just in the last few decades. And if you zoom out to what did this look like 5,000 years ago or so, well, basically your whole family was in one place and your community was in one place, your tribe was in one place. And, the social experience of a 4-year-old was lots of different humans and lots of gray hair and lots of little kids and and like that has changed so dramatically, so quickly. And I don't know what else to say other than I think we need to be much more thoughtful about that than we are. I barely know anyone working on this problem. I think for the most part, I see people just accept that this is what it is. And then we try to have a good preschool or something. And I'm like, that's not that's not actually solving the root problem. That's solving a cause or a problem that the root problem created. So anyway.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I will go for walks in our neighborhood and I'll come home and I'll tell my wife, oh, at such and such's house, yeah, the boys were out playing basketball, like it was awesome to watch, and it sounds like I'm admiring kids playing in a yard and doing these things way too much to the outside person, but it just brings me like happiness when I see just kids outside in large groups playing football, doing these things. And a lot of that, I think, has gotten lost. And I never know if it's like old man yelling at cloud, and just like keeping up with the times, or if there's something to it. But yeah, I want to tap into a lot of that very similar feeling that you have, because yeah, I mean, and even when you read, it's like we can overdo these myths and these stories, but hearing something like Bezos going to his grandparents' farm in the summers and just being bored, like having to deal with being bored just feels like a very good problem to solve. Like just getting like thrown outside with, analog things and creating your own world and universe versus having these sensory overload machines thrown at you. Like that's to me, that feels like a very real thing that there is some truth and value to it.
On the topic of boredom, which is not a way to cut that part off because this is anything but boredom. I've got a ton of notes here. We're going to go through these. I got to read some of the stuff back that you said. Hold boredom in your mind for a second. This probably should have happened at the beginning of the episode because some people are going to have no idea who you are. So either creative editing or if you made it this long, now you get the reveal. You guys met each other once, but John, in a couple of sentences, how do you explain what the hell you do with your time when you're not playing guitar or tennis or avoiding your problems?
So I would say truth is how the world really works. That's as opposed to how we think it works or how we want it to work. Truth is how the world really works, and wisdom is aligning your actions to truth. And so I spend most of my time trying to figure out how the world really works, and then occasionally we get an opportunity to invest behind that. And so I run a private investment partnership, but really we're trying to be a truth-seeking engine, machine, partnership. And occasionally that means we kind of figure out a little piece of what's going on and have an opportunity to put some capital behind it. And if we're right and we're wise, then we, turn that capital into more than we put in. But that's it. I tell most people I spend 80% of my time confused. And then, every now and then I feel like I figure something out. And I think that's true. I mean, that was true. I spent a decade building an enterprise software as a service business. It was the same thing. We pretend we know what we're doing, but, really it's a lot of, I often tell people everything for me that is not morality is an experiment. So I run a lot of experiments, a whole lot of experiments. And that's a means to figuring out what's true. And then every now and then you can line up truth and wisdom and you get to make an investment.
Wonderful. And of course, as a reminder, this is all preamble to you guys, getting while you're here. Matt, what about you? When
I don't have nearly as eloquent of an answer to that.
Nobody does.
Yeah,
you knew he was going to do that. You knew he had a quote.
Tough pairing.
Yeah.
So in kind of the traditionalist way, I was an investment professional who went on the entrepreneurial route of helping to build a podcast network that revolved around investing and finance podcasts, and have been doing that over the past 4 years, host business breakdowns. That's a key piece of it as well. I would say there is a connective tissue, which I've slowly appreciated over the years, that connects what I enjoy most doing professionally and what I enjoy most doing personally and how those interlap. And that is this massive obsession with things that get better with age. So that could be products, materials like leather or cedar. It could be businesses, not these businesses that have these, short boom cycles and then dwindle off, or you're looking at this trade. It's something that has this certain chemistry that allows for it to, we'll use the word compound over time, but also grow in terms of strength, culture, other attributes that grow around it. And everywhere I look around me in terms of time I spend, what I consume, what I purchase, what I look to build, it is all around things that get better with age, with a noticeable thing missing from that, which is I'm not this obsessive wine collector. So even with all of that said, whenever I mention that, people are always like, "Oh, so you must love wine." And it's, yeah, I appreciate wine for sure, but it doesn't fit like majorly into that intent study. So
Can I ask you to jam? So we unsurprisingly share that passion. So, but what are, if you were to pick, I don't know, 4 or 5 things you own that you're just excited for what they look like in 100 years when your kids' kids have them? Like, can you share a few of those?
And you can add things you wish you owned, just because we've
Yeah.
done messages about this too, and I just think it's delightful. All right, Matt,
yes,
go ahead. You're on the spot.
so I have a leather overnight bag that is from Italy, that was made in this shop where it was a father and his daughter hand making these goods. And the weathering, when you start to understand the chemistry that goes into leather, it's been around for 5,000 years. A lot of it is the same science with collagens breaking down, and there's more in terms of the collagens. But how it's tanned, how it wears, how, your own body chemistry impacts, how that leather takes shape and what it looks like over the future. So that's one thing that kind of immediately stands out to me. I have this other, I don't know that it will necessarily last 100 years, but it continues to improve in age, and the story of it improves, which is this old 1970s Woolrich, what I would call an overshirt, kind of like a chore coat. And this is great. I mean, you would think that it was created yesterday. And it has this story where, I've actually come into it more recently. It had taken a trip around the world. It was in Japan for a while. But when you get into the story of incredible business stories, read about John Woolrich and the whole culture that they built around that business. I mean, it might have honestly been a cult, but, having families on site, going through education class, the church, having everything there, and even some of the things they did when they had downturns, and him really looking to fund his. So there's like kind of a piece of the business behind it, the actual product. And then the last thing I will throw in there, the only other thing I would add into this is, I have this funny story about my travel watch that I had, which was not crazy expensive. It was Seiko SKX 007. It's once I learned about what automatic watches did in terms of converting your own body energy into batteries, I was like fascinated by it. The SKX is kind of one of those famous entry watches. And I had one for 5 or 6 years, and then I lost it during a hike in Patagonia. And I thought to myself, there's a famous saying, like, you can't let your products own you. You have to own your products. And I thought, you know what? This is a couple $100. We can just have the SKX too. It's the second model. It's the same watch, but I can tell the story of how I lost the first one in Patagonia. And that's one where, again, I can pass that down. My son can wear it. It's kind of like this nice thing. You don't feel bad about it. And all those things, whether it's the craftsmanship that goes into it, the products, the materials, those are what stand out. And then the biggest overarching thing is I love gardens and planting things that grow for a very long period of time. So that is also in the works at the Reustle household.
I love it. That's beautiful. Thank you.
I could have done an entire episode on things like that. So.
We'll have you back on for the gardening episode.
Yeah.
All right. So this is perfect segue into the first thing I had written down, which is this idea that time is one of the best filters we have. And I think that's fascinating based on like what you were just talking about, Matt. John, I think you were the one who actually said it.
Yeah, I mentally wrote that down because I thought it was, I was like, I need to borrow that for the future.
John, just reflecting back on this conversation, time as the best filter we have, I feel like that just kept showing up over and over and over again through all these points. Most recently, even in the break on that watch, where it's, here's this incredible watch and this incredible durability, but then also the story we tell about like Seiko 2. What do you think about that, John?
Okay, tying together a bunch of threads, including that one. We poked at AI and chose not to go there, but if you think about let's say the distinctly mechanical, trained on the digital exhaust of the internet, kind of where's all that going? The only question that can answer, whether you're trying to make a human a robot or whether you're making a real robot, is what has been and what ought to be replicated. It can't really answer this deeply human question of what ought to be. right? AI is never going to create the future. It might, create cars faster. It might automate the hedge fund analyst or something, but that's very different from why does Matt R love that beautiful Seiko watch? And does he want another one? And if he does, why? And if he doesn't, what else does he want? We can rapidly iterate product design through machines or people behaving like machines and so on, but that's a little different from, what future does Matt R want? What does he want to plant in his garden? Humans that behave like robots or robots themselves can suggest a bunch of things, but I'd be surprised if they ever are, they might help Matt R make a better or faster decision on what ought to be in the garden. But I'd be very surprised if that's something Matt R really loves, if they're ever just going to, come along one day where there's a pile of robots that shows up and plants a garden and Matt R is like, yep, that's what I wanted. Right. It skips the process. It skips the appreciation of beauty. It skips what makes Matt R human. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably the best. You can prod me if you want on other ways to take that, but that's kind of what comes to mind. I think that's sort of, it's part of what the filter of time does, right? Like what ought to stick around. I will be surprised if robots ever become very good curators of things. They can answer questions like, what are the great novels? But who chose to keep the novels around? That was human, right? They can try to write a great novel in the style of Jules Verne, but, I'd be surprised if they're inventing new genres. I think there'll be all sorts of mashups that look like new genres, but if you really, poke at it, the next great sci-fi story, I think will have a distinctly human element that at a minimum primed the robot to write it. And so I don't know, in some ways that's, humans, is one way to look at this is we're the apex predators on this planet. So we're shaping it more than anything else. And so what sticks around and what doesn't is sort of a product of, 8 billion humans alive today. Another way to look at it is just, what we create and what we do ultimately is in service of others, whether we see that or not. A successful product is only successful if someone else wants it. And even a CEO who's on a big ego trip and doesn't care, they go out of business eventually if they miss the fact that what they're doing is in service of other humans. And so, in some sense, I think time just compresses a lot of that. The stories that stick around are the stories that the humans wanted to stick around. The craft of gardening, which is a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down, right? Is just, the stuff that Matt R is drawing on to craft his current garden is the product of thousands of years of people, trying to kind of see how much do I need to respect nature as it is versus how much can I shape it in a way that I want to shape it. The same reason I love golf courses are this strange mix of let's respect what's there and then let's also shape it so we can hit a little ball in a hole. So anyway, that, I guess that's maybe the time point is, it's a beautiful filter because it's sort of a compression of what humans shaped, for years and years and years. And then we can just kind of use that filter and access whatever we're trying to access.
Matt, I'm going to cut out all of us talking and just send you the file of all the John flips on this. Don't worry. What do you think?
I know.
Any reflection?
The only thing I would say on the if I were to play devil's advocate on the idea of the robots, and this is certainly not a world that I want to live in. It's more of all right, let's not just close my brain off to it. But we have spent, the past 90 minutes talking about all these things that we have feelings that are true that we really can't tie into why or how or scientifically prove them. And if there is a mechanism to do that, it might be supercomputers that can really start to quickly iterate in terms of our preferences, dots that we did not understand how they were connected in terms of, smell to brain reaction, and, evolve with themselves. Like, there was this great line that I heard recently about humans don't create complex adaptive systems, we evolve them. And I think that's true. Like we might be evolving this thing that becomes this complex adaptive system, just like we are. Like, again, there's complexity in terms of, how all these things fit together. So that's the only like when you were initially mentioning that, I'm thinking like, in what possible case would that, not be true? And it's certainly something where I agree with that today. I think there's all the evidence in the world to point to it being the case today. And I just wonder about that in the
Mm,
future. But beyond that, I do think time is a great filter for so many reasons. And it is the evolution and, not survivorship bias necessarily, because you have to appreciate all the different things that went into that, survivorship. But I think oftentimes it's, what's in the DNA. And if we can study some of those things, it makes us appreciate it. And that's where something like leather comes into play. Like there's a reason why, it can withstand freezing temperatures or insanely hot temperatures in a way no other material can. It comes from, cattle, where it is literally their protective coat. So they've evolved over the years. So there's like very distinct things that we can point to. And then you get into the chemistry and it's really fun.
a fascinating, and I always love I mean, that was a great uh, pushback, rebuttal. I don't know, but I mean, I agree. I like the truth will be found in the dialogue, so to speak. So I appreciate that. I wonder, like, one way to frame this is, um, will AI ever write something that's the equivalent of the Beatles yesterday?
Hmm.
And I genuinely don't know, but I think like the rationalist approach would say that, the Beatles and everybody else writing music were just monkeys on a typewriter. And eventually, if you get enough monkeys with enough typewriters, one of them produces Shakespeare, right? And so that would be the argument for, if we can, iterate infinitely, a Beatles song is going to fall out of that. The flip side of that would be, McCartney, when he woke up one morning and kind of had the tune of yesterday in his head, and he thought it was somebody else's song, and he went to his producer and he went to a number of other musicians and kind of said, I have this tune. Like, did I hear it from you? And he talked to enough people and they all said no. And he's like, okay, I guess it's mine. Or if he, I mean, just the way this theme of, Michael Jackson wanted a song with a great bass, great bass hook. And a week later he had Billie Jean, but he didn't sit down at a keyboard to write it, right? It came to him. Or he look at Rick Rubin, he believes that, I mean, great music is a gift from God. And there's this great theme in the history of music of being inspired by the muse, the history of all art, really. And so there, I guess the counter, so one is, enough monkeys on enough typewriters, we get Shakespeare and the Beatles and whatever. The other is there's something else going on there, metaphysical, spiritual, whatever, that is so uniquely human that monkeys and typewriters could never quite tap into. And I don't know the answer. I have my suspicions, but we all have a front row seat to how it's going to play out.
It's very interesting, and it gets into what you were mentioning earlier on with, like, there's limitations to language and ways that we can explain certain things because there's not enough words, especially in the English language, to tap into all of the emotions and characteristics of things. But it's very interesting because if you kind of break it down at an atomic level, like, what makes yesterday this great thing, and like isolating the different variables, and in some ways, if it was created by AI, would we have the same appreciation for it? And like, I think it's fair to question whether that would be the case. Like, there's so many different things that factor into it beyond the lyrics, the tune, something else. But like that alone, if a human delivering it being one of the biggest pieces is the answer, that alone might, prove the truth. So it's one of these really fun things to talk through and kind of like think about.
I think a little clue to this that we get, and again, it's not the answer, but the Eagles have been so aggressive with their enforcing copyright that basically if you say a song name, if you say the certain things that are too close to this is the Eagles IP, it gets taken down from YouTube. You can't play it on TV and so on. And so there are actually a lot of cases of people trying to reference the Eagles without being able to play the exact riffs or say the exact words. And my point is, if you go experience those things, my reaction to it, others may be different, is it doesn't get it, right?
Yeah.
It's there's something there that's just not like, it didn't have the word, it didn't have the riff, everything about it felt the same, but it was missing the word, or it was missing the riff, or it was missing and so I don't know if that's, pointing us towards what's true there, or maybe just deceiving us, but I find that interesting.
Very interesting.
there's a network around truth, right? There's always like back to that nuance point on the gravestone or back to exploring the
Mm,
thing. Like, does yesterday carry the weight of yesterday without Ed Sullivan? Like
mm,
how do these things tie together?
mm.
Yeah.
All right, we're dropping this question on you. I think you brought it up, Matt. So you're going to go first. Jobs you wanted to have as a little kid? What was the top of the leaderboard besides astronaut and professional
Um,
athlete, presumably? In how many
yeah,
sports?
professional
Beyond Bo
athlete
Jackson.
was always there for some of us. I had sailor on my, my mom delivered a large package of things from when I was a child. So I think I've always appreciated the sea. I don't remember wanting to be a sailor. But then as I got older, I will admit I had like a very shallow stage of life where it was um, matching a profession to something I was interested in, but it was like lawyer. I didn't ever want to go into the medical field. And then I considered the world of business kind of mixed in there. And then in college is when it evolved, where I found economics and I thought, like, this is amazing because it's very straightforward to me. It's kind of like, on the easy scale, like, and interesting to expand my brain. Then I mixed in finance with it. And I enjoyed markets once I started to dive into those a lot. So it was a slow evolution, moving away from astronaut, figuring my way around things, and then I would say markets and that world took over at some point in college.
Go ahead, John. Little boy John. What did you want to
Yeah.
be when you growed up? And then I guess how did it evolve too? That was really cool the way that you wrapped that together, Matt.
Oh, I'd say it's still evolving, but
As it should
the yeah, what's the somebody's got a line that like part of your job in life is to figure out what your life's work ought to be.
be.
And so I think we're all still kind of poking at that and trying lots of things in pursuit of that. But when I was little, my dad in the 80s was what was then called a stockbroker. And so, CNBC was on at night and the ticker tape, and I had no idea what all that stuff meant. But like 5-year-old John's like watching all the numbers, and I'm like, that looks cool, so that there was that for a while. My first girlfriend, when she asked me the question, I said, I want to be a CEO. And she said, what's that? And I realized I didn't really know either. So,
More
and
importantly,
then
was she impressed?
no, she had no idea. What's that? I was like, well, it's, I guess they're the boss. And, and then in college, I mean, I studied economics, philosophy, and Chinese in college. And that was because every time I took Econ 101, I was like, hey, this is great. Let's do that. And then I took philosophy 101. I was like, hey, this is great. Let's do that. I took a Chinese course. I was like, hey, this is great. And so when I actually had to start finding a job, all I could muster together in terms of words was I want to solve hard business problems. Like, who does that? And so somebody suggested management consulting, someone else suggested investment banking, and I kind of looked at all that. And anyway, I ended up in Singapore as a strategy consultant for, career one. Loved that. Could start to see that robots were eating up the kind of management consulting analyst. I mean, this was like early SaaS days, like pre-cloud, but could sort of see that, Excel was getting a lot better and eventually it was going to be run by robots. So I thought, well, I know what side of that I want to be on. So I went and built enterprise software for a decade. Loved that. Behind all that, I was investing. And at some point, all like nights, weekends, mornings, like all my free time was going to, just investing stuff. And I was like, all right, I know if my goal is to serve my partners well, I know the thing I wake up in the morning thinking about. And so I had to figure out how to make that the next evolution. And that's why I left the software world and started an investment partnership.
Inside of this comment, and it was John, it was your story about going to the cathedral and the organ concerts, which I love because I had a very similar experience. And granted, I was with like a group of singers, and we were part of this like Bach festival in Germany in high school. And a big part of it was like I got to go to all these amazing churches and hear all these amazing like OG pipe organs from like hundreds, if not thousands of years ago playing Bach. And it was just completely just encompassing in my brain. I was thinking about this from Chris Abdelmasih. I don't know if you guys know him or not, but Chris is great. And he planted this seed in my head the other day, and I wrote a post about it, about how trying to create both periods and pyramids in work, where like periods are like things I'm focused on at one point of time and kind of realizing there's a connective thread that's sticking with me for a while, kind of like the job stories you both just told. But then also like pyramids. Like, what are the things that actually stretch across this in my own body of work and whatever that looks like in however many years, however many more gray hairs, but also across generations. Help me with this a little bit. And Matt, go first. Like, this relationship between the periods of what we're doing and then the pyramids that we want to stretch beyond it, like a nice watch or a good cut of leather.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know how much you could merge them. I mean, just taking it without too much further context. I often think about individual projects, like perhaps in podcast episode, that I'm doing. And let's take last week we covered Apollo, and I want that episode in isolation to be this great thing. And, people are going to consume it over the years. But then I also view it as going into this collection, which paired together actually has this much greater value and the ability to search through all of the texts of those transcripts, connect dots between things. That's what I think of as kind of like the thing that really grows with more power over time is the library and archive of things that compile together. Is actually, way more valuable than each individual thing in isolation. So that's one thing. And then there are tasks that I think about, like I still need to, finish up my taxes. That is a period. I need to do them right. There's a way to, make sure that I am not rewarding, the government more than they need to be rewarded, paying my fair share. And that is, an isolation that needs to be taken care of everything. And I kind of view that as a blocking and tackling exercise. Versus some writing that I might want to do that's going to, be out there with this infinite duration, and can be consumed over time and be appreciated over time. So that's probably how I would do my best job. Chris is excellent at thinking through these things, so I can't even compare to him, but hopefully I did a fair job.
You did a fair job. What about you, John? Just this connection between the periods of what you're working on and the pyramids that you're trying to build. And I know you think long scale on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, well, Matt, you put that really beautifully. I mean, there's something, there's a joy in producing timeless content, and so there's things I do, generally things I write where, I mean, I've been on this power laws kick lately, and I really do just believe that is how the world works, and power laws are a product of complex adaptive systems, and complex adaptive systems exhibit sensitive dependence on initial conditions and have feedback loops and evolve over time. And so there's a certain sort of just poking at, when you get to truth and then you sort of put it out there in a way where somebody could read that today or 100 years from now. And if I've really touched some truth, when they read it doesn't really matter. And so those are pyramids in a way. And then obviously our work, builds on itself. And then the periods I think are the steps on the way there, maybe. Every year you do have to do your taxes. It's not uncommon for me to write something that doesn't stand the test of time. But I know if I don't do my taxes and I don't keep writing, I won't get to the pyramids. So maybe that's it. I mean, ultimately my framing is truth is how the world really works. And so when you touch truth, you're articulating that accurately. And then wisdom is aligning our actions to truth. And so when you're sort of figure out a way to do that, I mean, those things ought to be timeless. And then studying complex adaptive systems and power laws and all the other things we do, producing a body of timeless content. I mean, those are the means to get to truth and learn how to, operate with wisdom.
Awesome. I got to ask 2 cultural touch points. John, you tell me this first. Did you ever, Oliver Sacks, you familiar with this stuff? Did you ever do Musicophilia? Do you know this book?
Tell me more.
Do you know this book, Matt? Is this in your, you an Oliver Sacks guy?
I have to say I was insecure coming on here because of my lack of musical knowledge. So
that's a safe space.
I've been able to navigate it quite well thus far. John not knowing it either. Thank you. Give me an out.
This is like the weird cross section. And I don't remember exactly how Oliver Sacks's books, so he studies fringe cases decades ago in all sorts of cognitive problems. So he's a neurologist and is a brain guy, but he was always fascinated in the fringe cases. So like the entry level book that everybody should read is The Man Who Mistook His Woman for a Hat. And it's like a lot of like pre-pop psychology stuff, but he's like what's going on in these really weird fringe cases, and then how do they actually tell us about how music or how our brains function. And he did a whole book just on music. So a lot of like financial therapy, which you're talking about, that person who does stuff like that, it's all in there where he's just like, okay, this is a person who has what's it called when you can't control the shake muscular dystrophy? What's the
Parkinson's is one. Yeah.
Parkinson's, and there's something else, and I can't remember that. You're calling on a book that I haven't read in like 20 years now.
You're calling on the book.
But uncontrollable shaking, right?
And uncontrollable shaking. And he's like, he figures out he can like play this, and he's always looking at these out of the box solutions. Like, I'll play this music and I get this person to stop shaking.
It's like people with speech issues where they're going to stutter. Oftentimes if they sing the verse, they won't stutter.
Yeah. So a ton of this stuff actually comes out of these crazy experiments that Oliver Sacks would figure out to run with these like fringe brain patients and other things. Really phenomenally interesting person.
Paradox is not that you're only talking about paradox, but the book, who was it? Gödel, Escher, Bach was this like beautiful meditation on, you look at an Escher drawing and it's the stairs that look like they're going up or going down. And there's this paradox, and you get that with Bach's fugues where they kind of loop back on themselves in strange and unexpected, but ultimately delightful ways. And you get in mathematics as well, and you sort of get these in the world of logic, the assertion this sentence is not true is it's this funny paradox, right? It's like if you stay in a certain box of epistemology, it breaks the box, and if you're willing to step outside of it, then you have to admit that the box is bigger than the box you put it in. And so anyway, there's lots of things like that. I think it's the same thing we get at with music, which you're hinting at too. It's like, I don't know why playing Bob Dylan helps me make better decisions, but I believe it does. I don't know why my friend who works in musical therapy, like why that heals patients, but it does. And I think the wise response to that is, let's take it seriously.
Take it seriously. Absolutely. Hey, any thoughts of that, Matt? Without feeling out of your depth?
No, I completely agree. I think it's, to your point, you don't necessarily have to know why, but if you believe, I'm kind of in the camp where I believe that what is the term that I'm looking for? Placebo effect is actually this insanely powerful thing that you can use to your advantage. Sometimes I'll change something in my routine. I feel better. Is it related to that? It almost doesn't matter. As long as I continue to have that feeling, I'm okay with it. As long as there's not something detrimental to, to my health. It's like if it was chugging a bottle of vodka every night and I felt better the next day, that's a different story. But I honestly think sometimes we can appreciate these things, and, slowly over time it will come out. And I think, to wrap it all together, like the music element is something that's very big that I think we all have an appreciation for. And you might as well just kind of lean into it.
See how it works for you. All right, it's time to play the game. We're going to see if we can do this. John, you want to take a stab? What do you think? I needed to get Matt and John together for.
So I've been writing, knowing you were going to ask me that, and an hour ago, I think Matt R, you said you have on your Twitter, it's a tombstone to the death of Nuance. And something about, so my answer would be, I think we're kindred spirits in a lot of ways. One is, we're in pursuit of nuance. Or I might add the word in pursuit of wisdom. So that's my guess.
I love that. Matt, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, at first I was been playing the thing throughout, and I'm like, all right, is there this parenting element here? With the launch of the conversation, are we tapping into something? My thought was this element of business, investing, and some of those dynamics paired with this much higher level thinking and nuance to get into it, some appreciation for some kind of more philosophical approaches to life. And those two things paired was what led to them.
Also, the fun part about this too is like, you write something down, and I wrote this down like, weeks ago, and I put this, and it doesn't
it's
match.
More true than now. I mean,
yeah, it's almost true. But this is the spirit of it. I love what both of you said, because you're both hinting at kind of what I wrote down. So I wrote down, powerful stories are power laws unto themselves, right? With a question mark, because I need to go into this. And I wanted to start on the bedtime stories because I just feel like you guys are both such gifted tellers and curators of stories in your own work. I was like, oh my God, there's definitely a sandbox at home. This is getting tinkered with in the most delightful of ways.
I like that. I often like to hearing it because I would say there's so many similarities, but then hearing how John thinks through some of these things, it just opens up my perspective in much different ways. And then having these kind of like core things that he can tie back to, which I actually think is one of the keys to storytelling, is starting off your answers with some of these like beautiful, really deep, 1 to 2 line things that then can be expanded upon. I'm like, again, time is a great filter.
We got it recorded. There'll be plenty of chances for you guys to hear them back too. Matt, if people want to find more, where can they get you in their network, connect with you on the internet? Where should they follow you along?
Yeah, Twitter, I still post on there
Holding out.
at a somewhat regular basis. That's at Russell Matt. JoinColossus.com has business breakdowns at all the shows from Colossus. And those are 2 of the main places you can find me.
All good, all good. And John, what about you? Best places to connect with you and bug you on the internet?
Yeah, so johncandeto.com links to everything else. So Phronesis Fund is the investment partnership. My family values are on there, which is a whole other values-based living thing you could jam on. There's other things as well. There's many experiments. There's a documentation of that crazy road trip we did. So but johncandeto.com, and then choose your own adventure from there.
Absolutely choose your own adventure. Follow both of these guys, get connected, bug them wherever you can, and don't think twice. It's all right. Or more appropriately, we're going to see if this works here. I mean, let's be honest, what we really need to go out on. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate the time today.
Thank you so much. This was
Thanks
fun.
for having us. Yeah, this is great.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below to Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Zeigler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.